Star Wars has always had some interesting questions around what redemption actually means. With so many different authors for various types of media, there's also a few different ways the same event or character can get interpreted. In today's video, we're going to talk about a character in the Legends Expanded Universe who I think makes an interesting example of both of those things, Jedi Master Kyp Durron, who was potentially responsible for one of the biggest atrocities in galactic history. Kyp was born 7 years before the Battle of Yavin in the Outer Rim on a world named Daer. His parents, like most of Daer's inhabitants, were outspoken against the Empire. Initially, they were mostly left alone despite their opposition because of their remote location. But when the planet's protests grew stronger following events like the Gorman Massacre and the destruction of Alderaan, the Empire cracked down on them. Entire cities were destroyed, and many, including Kyp Durron and his parents, were taken captive and sent to the prison colony on Kessel. Kyp's older brother Szeth was also captured, although he was conscripted into the Stormtrooper Corps and sent to the Imperial Academy on Karita. Kyp remained imprisoned on Kessel for years, forced to work within the planet's spice mines. In 5 ABY, after the Emperor's death, control over the prison shifted from the Imperials to Mora the Dual, a Rybit who had worked administrating the prison while developing his own connections with underground smuggling rings through the spice mines right under the Empire's nose. While technically no longer prisoners of the Empire, Kyp and the others on the planet remained as slaves working in the mines for Dual, unaware that the Empire had even fallen. Kyp's parents were killed in the riots which installed Dual, leaving Kyp largely to fend for himself. While he was imprisoned there, he met an elderly woman who was actually a former Jedi named Vima Debota. She recognized a strong latent talent for the Force in the boy. Eventually she was removed by the guards, but in her short time with Kyp, she began training him to use the Force. In 11 ABY, these Force abilities helped Kyp Durron escape the prison with the also recently incarcerated Han Solo and Chewbacca. They fled from Kessel in the direction of the maze of black holes known as the Maw, where they were captured yet again by Admiral Dalla and her fleet of 4 Star Destroyers, which were stationed at a secret weapons development facility inside the Maw. Dalla had been in communication with the Empire for over a decade and was unaware, much like the prisoners on Kessel, that Tarkin, who had been her lover, had been killed in the destruction of the first Death Star, with Palpatine and the second Death Star following soon after. The Maw installation, being protected by Dalla, was one of the areas where research had been done to build the Death Stars, and it was also home to some other experimental superweapons. One of these was the skeleton of a prototype Death Star, while another was a nearly indestructible fighter-sized superweapon called the Sun Crusher. This vessel was armed with resonance torpedoes, which could be fired into a sun, destabilizing it and destroying an entire system all at once. The Sun Crusher became the key to Kyp, Han, and Chewbacca's escape, along with a captive scientist named Qui Shux. Once they had fled the installation on board the superweapon, they handed it over to New Republic's government, and Kyp went to Luke's new academy on Yavin, becoming one of his first handful of students. On his way to the academy, Kyp worked with Wedge Antilles to send the Sun Crusher into Yavin itself, the gas giant, theoretically rendering it unable to be recovered or used any longer. Once formally enrolled in the Jedi Praxium, Kyp proved to be Luke's most promising student, demanding more and more of the Jedi Master's time. But even with this enhanced focus, Kyp believed that he wasn't progressing as fast as he could be, leading to the age-old refrain that Luke was holding him back in some way, which we so often hear from people about to do some dark stuff. Part of this feeling came, kind of understandably, from Kyp's traumatic past. One of the things fueling his desire to learn to use the Force as quickly as he did was the idea that he could protect himself from being helpless in those kinds of situations ever again. Ultimately, this really just points to the fact that the Jedi Order should involve some in-house therapy instead of just non-mandatory requests that someone meditate a bit sometimes. Luke had made another terrible decision in putting his academy on Yavin 4, given that a long-dead Sith Lord named Exar Kun still haunted the moon, residing in a temple very close to the one used by the Jedi as their academy. Kun had already nearly corrupted one of Luke's other students, named Gantoris, and then incinerated him before Kyp's arrival, which really should have been a clue to Luke that this was not a great place to take troubled but talented youth as they learned superpowers. Kun reinforced the idea that Luke was holding Kyp back, and offered to show him the secrets of the dark side and the Sith instead. Kyp maintained a deep-seated need for revenge against the Empire, pledging himself to the Sith Lord's tutelage, and this ultimately was where one of the differences in perspective from different authors comes in. In a certain sense, Kyp was being controlled by Exar Kun, but it's kind of up to you or the author of whichever work you're looking at to decide how strong that control actually was. At the very least, we can say that Kyp wasn't just a vessel containing Kun's spirit or something, taking control of his body. Conversely, there are some pretty clear signs that Kyp wasn't acting entirely of his own accord. Now fully under the influence of Exar Kun, whatever that may mean, he traveled to Ethor where he tracked down Qui Shux, the scientist who had escaped Dala with him, and who had been at least partially responsible for the creation of the Imperial superweapons which had caused so much harm. He stripped the knowledge of the superweapons from her mind, causing a lot of collateral damage, including the removal of her knowledge of Wedge Antilles, with whom she had been building a relationship. Kyp then returned to Yavin, using the Force to remote control the Sun Crusher out of the planet, knocked Luke into a coma, and then began a campaign of revenge against the Empire, wanting to eradicate every last vestige of the regime. First, he tracked Admiral Dala to the Cauldron Nebula, blowing the nebula up in an attempt to destroy her fleet. He then went to the Karita system and demanded to know what happened to his brother, threatening to eradicate the system if they didn't answer. The planet's ambassador, Fergan, and the comms officer lied to him that his brother had died in a training accident years before, sending Kyp further into despair and causing him to fire the resonance torpedoes, starting the 2-hour chain reaction to destroy the system. Unlike the Cauldron Nebula, which only contained military targets, at least arguably, Karita was home to 25+ million beings. The panicked administration admitted that Kyp's brother Szeth was not only alive, but in the system. With no way to stop what he had already set in motion, Kyp tried to rescue his brother, ultimately failing and seeing Szeth get disintegrated by the supernova he himself had caused. He attempted to continue his assault on Imperials in the deep core, but the combination of the arrival of Han Solo and the destruction of Kun's spirit on Yavin made him snap out of his rage and surrender to his friend, consumed by grief. He was brought before representatives of the New Republic's government, some of whom demanded he be executed, but Mon Mothma, the chief of state, ultimately entrusted his fate to Luke. Luke, feeling he was mostly acting under the influence of Kun and that he could be redeemed, returned him to the school and continued his training, forcing him to confront an apparition of Kun within his old temple in a trial similar to what Luke himself had faced on Dagobah. Kyp initially was tempted to destroy the apparition with Force lightning and then a lightsaber, but ultimately decided to let go of his anger and not act aggressively, causing the apparition to turn into the spirit of his brother and dissipate after thanking him for freeing him, passing the test Luke himself had failed. Luke also required Kyp to help destroy the Sun Crusher by sending it into the Maw's black holes, an action which nearly ended up costing Kyp his life when it turned into a confrontation with other superweapons from the Maw installation. But when these events come up later, we get some differing interpretations of the extent to which Kyp was under Kun's control. This gets discussed pretty heavily and directly in the novel I, Jedi by Michael Stackpole, which retells part of the Jedi Academy trilogy from a different character's perspective. This character, Corran Horn, points out it was not Kun's desire to attack the Empire, it was Kyp's. He further points out that if Kun was truly in command of Kyp probably would have just killed Luke, something Exar Kun certainly wished to do, rather than simply knocking him unconscious to get him out of the way. Corran argues that this was because Kyp didn't want to kill Luke. Ultimately, it was Kyp's desires and goals that were being fulfilled here, particularly his need to like this video, subscribe for more, and get revenge on the Empire. In some ways though, while I agree with a lot of what Corran is saying, I think I, Jedi takes the position of Luke here, which was effectively supposed to be a representation of Luke's actions in the Jedi Academy trilogy where the story originated, in a less than charitable direction. Luke dismisses Corran's critique in I, Jedi as being kind of unfounded and a result of Corran not trusting people enough. But I think the counter that Luke would make if it was his Jedi Academy trilogy self was that whatever Kyp's desire for revenge had been, those impulses would never be things that Kyp acted upon if not for the injection of Kun's will. Kyp's responsibility was in making himself vulnerable to Kun and giving in to that. It was Kun who twisted Kyp's grief and anger into the rampage of atrocities that he actually went on. Kyp's emotional state throughout each event shows him becoming more or less vulnerable to it, and then his actions change significantly once Exar Kun is gone. So I think Luke's position in the Jedi Academy trilogy would have been that what might otherwise have been an understandable hatred of the Empire was able to be turned into genocidal actions entirely because of Kun. But Corran does have a point in that when Kyp really didn't want to do something, it was possible for him to just not do that. And I think what this kind of reveals about the control Exar Kun had over Kyp was that he was kind of just pushing him more and more towards the dark side, with that being Kun's short-term goal more so than getting Kyp to do any specific action. Like, when Palpatine says strike him down, he's not saying that because he's actually thinking Luke will strike him down and that's good for him personally. It's because setting him further down that path makes him more susceptible to his control and the dark side's control. Not that I think this then means that Kyp actually isn't responsible for anything he did, just that I don't think the framing that Corran has in iJedi is entirely accurate. We are in a universe where the Force and the dark side are real, so who's to say what the limits are of a super powerful dark side user's influence and control over a traumatized teenager? It's not quite analogous to just looking at a bunch of online propaganda and saying that that influenced your actions. It's someone who's much more literally in your brain influencing what you're doing. We then get a few different directions for Kyp from here on out as well. In several of the stories, whether books, comics, or short stories released over the next few years, Kyp was essentially a devotee of Skywalker and was incredibly guilt-ridden, to the point of being nearly suicidal in some cases. There's a short story where he assists a smuggler in a rescue mission under an alias because of how infamous he was as a mass murderer, and when confronted about it says that if she killed him, he'd probably deserve it. This version of Kyp is a bit less judgmental of others than what we might see later. When the new Jedi Order series started coming out, Kyp's attitude towards Luke and the role of the Jedi was taken in a different direction. The author of the first New Jedi Order book, Vector Prime, created a kind of maverick Jedi character who exceeded the bounds of his own authority in order to hunt petty criminals in the Outer Rim. Lucasfilm then suggested that this person be Kyp, essentially playing into his dislike of outlaws like Duel and turning him into someone who challenged Luke's authority, saying the Jedi needed to be more proactive in general. He became a hothead hardliner, aggressively pursuing the war against the Yuuzhan Vong and leading a faction within the Jedi who were similarly dissatisfied with Luke's leadership, particularly with what they saw as his inaction against the Yuuzhan Vong. Kyp is nothing short of incredibly frustrating in these books, but I also think he's interesting. Luke's fears about confronting the Yuuzhan Vong and becoming an even greater threat if they fall to the dark side are understandable on one hand, but so are Kyp's feelings that they can't just stand by and do nothing, even if he takes it to a pretty heinous extreme, lying to and taking advantage of other Jedi, particularly his friend Han's daughter Jaina, to trick her into attacks on a Yuuzhan Vong civilian world ship by claiming it's a superweapon. He pretty much acts rashly without good information throughout most of the war as well, getting most of his followers killed. A lot then gets made in these books of the fact that Kyp was doing a pretty terrible job of repaying Luke for essentially saving him from potential execution. The Jedi had plenty of political opposition, something Luke was coming up against in his attempts to form a Jedi Council, and Kyp's past actions gave them plenty of ammo to use against the Jedi. To many, he seemed like a vigilante who had gotten away punishment-free with being responsible for a giant atrocity, and it's hard to argue with that point of view. It's not hard to understand why people might be against giving the Jedi more powerful when Kyp was kind of the poster boy for them in this period. His relationship with Luke started to turn around a bit more when Luke was able to successfully reform the Jedi Council. This started as a half-Jedi, half-government official advisory board to the new Chief of State, noted Steve Martin impersonator Cal Omas. One of this 6 Jedi members was Kyp himself. To Luke, this was partially a way to keep the opposition inside the house, and it was something that really threw Kyp off. He wasn't sure why he was there when he was at the first meeting. This is where we start to see Kyp slowly coming more and more over to Luke's side and supporting him when necessary, rather than continuing to oppose him at every opportunity. As the Jedi move into the Second Galactic Civil War and the Legacy of the Force novels and then into Fate of the Jedi, Kyp tended to become more and more supportive of Luke and one of the more effective members of the Jedi Council, and it was more common to see him on the right side of issues. In some ways, depending on how you label Exar Kun's influence, this does seem like a guy who got away with atrocities though. And we certainly have books like I, Jedi by Michael Stackpole which view him that way and reinforce that interpretation, which honestly I end up having a lot of sympathy for, especially early on. But I think his story and character progression end up being an interesting one because of the continual reference to these actions, and then his shift back into being this kind of defiant figure. takes what otherwise would have just been a full absolution once he's no longer on the dark side into a broader arc of growth. I don't necessarily think it should have required him becoming a problem again for them to wrestle with what his past actions actually meant, but I think this is at least a step above how most of these redemption stories go, where when a character comes back from the dark side, they're just kind of treated as an entirely different person, and then most times they just end up dying, so they never really have to contend with what they did in the past either. I don't necessarily love Kyp or every part of his progression, but I think he has a lot more layers to him than other characters who go down a dark path. My favorite stories that really wrestle with what some of this means, what redemption means, and what taking accountability actually means are the Alphabet Squadron books, but I still think Kyp's story is an interesting step in that direction. That's going to do it for today though. Let me know in the comments what you think of Kyp and his storyline. Special thanks to Marmar for editing this video, and to the patrons and channel members who make this channel possible.